Welcome to our deep dive into the work of Dr. Jordan Peterson. We've got a really interesting selection of excerpts from his book, 12 Rules for Life. So today we're going to unpack some of his most compelling ideas about psychology, mythology, and personal development and see what insights we can gain.
It's really fascinating stuff, isn't it? Peterson's work delves into the human condition, exploring those universal experiences that connect us all. A great example is his idea about dealing with the unknown.
Yeah, it really struck me how he emphasizes this universal experience of grappling with the unknown, regardless of our backgrounds. Why do you think this resonates so deeply with people?
Well, it speaks to our fundamental need for security and our desire to make sense of a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable. It's like we're all trying to find our footing on shaky ground.
That's a great analogy, and it makes me think about Peterson's critique of happiness as the ultimate goal. It's almost as if he's suggesting that by trying to cling to happiness, we're actually avoiding the deeper, more meaningful aspects of life, those aspects that inevitably involve confronting the unknown.
Absolutely. He challenges the idea that happiness is the be-all and end-all, arguing that it's a rather shallow pursuit, especially when faced with the reality of suffering. He even uses a powerful quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the author who survived the Soviet Gulag, Solzhenitsyn, called the idea that humans are created for happiness a pitiful ideology when confronting real suffering.
Wow, that really puts things into perspective. It seems like Peterson is pushing us beyond that simple pursuit of happiness towards something more profound. Would you say he's advocating for embracing meaning, even if it means encountering discomfort or pain?
Precisely. He seems to be saying that true meaning often arises from confronting challenges, from wrestling with those difficult questions that life throws our way. He even uses a fascinating analogy to illustrate this, drawing a connection between human behavior and, of all things, lobsters.
Ah, yes, the famous lobster hierarchy. I have to admit I was initially skeptical, but I found myself drawn in by the parallels he draws between lobster behavior and our own social dynamics. Could you explain a bit more about this for our listener?
Sure. So Peterson highlights that lobsters, like humans, exist within social hierarchies. Their position within these hierarchies influences their serotonin levels, which then impacts their posture, behavior, and even their brain chemistry.
So is he suggesting that, just like lobsters, our social standing dictates our sense of well-being? Does that mean we're all just slaves to our biology?
Well, it's not quite that simple. While the analogy offers a compelling insight into the biological underpinnings of social behavior, human behavior is far more complex. We're not just reacting to serotonin fluctuations. But it does raise an interesting question: to what extent do these ancient biological mechanisms still influence us today? And how do we navigate these inherent drives in a way that aligns with our values?
That's a really thought-provoking question. It seems Peterson is prompting us to acknowledge these deeply ingrained biological influences, not to be controlled by them, but to better understand how they might be shaping our perceptions and interactions.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears a bit, Peterson also introduces a rather intriguing principle known as Price's Law, or the Matthew Principle. This principle, as he explains it, applies to a surprisingly wide range of phenomena.
Yes, this one really caught my attention. It's almost unsettling how this principle seems to govern everything from the distribution of matter in the universe to the success of artists and scientists. For example, he gives the example that a small percentage of scientists produce the majority of impactful research. He even points out that the distribution of matter in the universe follows this pattern, with a few massive objects holding most of the mass.
It really makes you think. What's fascinating about the Matthew Principle is that it challenges our assumptions about fairness and equality. If this pattern is so deeply ingrained in nature, what does it mean for our attempts to create a more equitable society?
Mhm.
Is it even possible to achieve true equality, or are we always going to be contending with this inherent unevenness?
That's a big question, and one that I think we'll be pondering long after this deep dive. It seems like Peterson is pushing us to grapple with the complexities of the world, to acknowledge those patterns and principles that might not fit neatly into our idealized notions of how things should be.
Absolutely. And this leads us to another intriguing aspect of Peterson's work, his perspective on nature itself. He presents a view of nature as having a due nature, being both static and dynamic.
Yes, he describes it as a kind of layered complexity, with some aspects changing rapidly while others remain relatively stable over vast periods of time. I was trying to wrap my head around this. Could you give an example of this dynamic for our listener?
Okay, well, imagine a forest. The leaves are constantly changing, falling, and growing anew. That's the dynamic aspect. But the trees themselves change much more slowly, and the overall structure of the forest, the ecosystem itself, might remain relatively stable for centuries. It's a constant interplay between stability and change, a kind of dance between order and chaos.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's like a reminder that even in the midst of constant flux, there's an underlying order, a deeper structure at play.
Precisely. And this understanding of nature's complexity is essential for navigating the challenges we face as individuals and as a society. We need to be able to recognize those patterns that persist over time while also adapting to the inevitable changes that come our way.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it? Speaking of delicate balances, Peterson delves into another fascinating concept, positive feedback loops. He explains how these escalating cycles can lead to a range of issues, from addiction to anxiety and even agoraphobia.
Yeah, the analogy he uses is that of a microphone and speaker feedback loop, where the signal gets amplified, leading to that ear-splitting screech. It's a great way to visualize how these loops can spiral out of control. Let's take the example of agoraphobia, a fear of open or public spaces. Imagine someone with anxiety having a panic attack in a crowded place.
That must be terrifying. I can see how that experience could make them hesitant to venture out again.
Exactly. And each time they try to go out, their anxiety spikes, reinforcing the belief that the outside world is dangerous. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, trapping them in this vicious cycle of avoidance and fear. The initial fear, the panic attack, gets amplified each time they try to confront it, making it harder and harder to break free.
So these positive feedback loops essentially hijack our natural responses, creating these patterns that are really hard to break free from. It's like our own minds turning against us. But Peterson doesn't shy away from exploring difficult emotions. He even tackles the often misunderstood emotion of anger. He presents a surprisingly nuanced perspective on anger, suggesting that it can actually be a powerful force for good.
What's fascinating is that he sees value in anger, arguing that it plays a crucial role in setting boundaries, asserting oneself, and resisting oppression. It's not about lashing out indiscriminately, but about channeling that energy in a constructive way. He even uses the example of soldiers developing PTSD, not just from what happened to them, but from what they witnessed themselves capable of doing.
That's a really powerful point. It highlights how anger can reveal our capacity for both good and evil. It's like a double-edged sword. It can protect us and propel us forward, but it can also wound us and those around us. It seems like Peterson is advocating for a kind of mindful anger, an anger that is aware of its potential for both destruction and creation. It makes you think about how we often try to suppress or deny anger, but perhaps there's a way to engage with it in a healthier, more productive way.
That's a great insight, and this leads us to another crucial aspect of Peterson's work, the importance of self-care and telling the truth.
Yeah, he has a whole section about how taking care of oneself is a moral obligation.
Why do you think he places such emphasis on this idea?
Well, he argues that you can't be good to others if you're not good to yourself. It's like trying to pour from an empty cup. He emphasizes that self-care is not selfish.
Yeah.
It's a necessary foundation for a meaningful and fulfilling life. It's a good point. He even shares this story about a client with paranoid personality disorder who actually trusted him because of his honest, even if challenging, responses. It's almost as if sometimes a little tough love is what we need to get back on track. It's a reminder that honesty, even when it's difficult, can be a powerful catalyst for growth.
Absolutely. That honesty, that willingness to confront difficult truths, is a recurring theme in Peterson's work. And speaking of confronting difficult truths, he delves into Dostoevsky's Underground Man and how that character connects to his advice on choosing friends wisely.
Yes. The Underground Man is a character who embodies resentment and nihilism. How does Peterson use this character to illustrate the importance of choosing our company carefully?
Well, he uses the Underground Man as a cautionary tale about the dangers of surrounding yourself with negativity. He suggests that we should choose friends who want to make the world a better place, people who uplift us and challenge us to be better versions of ourselves.
It makes you think about the company you keep and the impact it has on your own outlook and aspirations. Are the people around you pulling you down or lifting you up? It's a powerful message, especially in today's world where negativity and cynicism can be so pervasive.
It is. It's a reminder that we have a choice in who we allow to influence us, and that choosing wisely can have a profound impact on our own well-being and growth. Now, shifting gears a bit, Peterson also delves into the topic of parenting, particularly his critique of overprotection, especially when it comes to children. He uses a rather striking phrase, the tyranny of the overprotected child.
Yes, he seems to be suggesting that by trying to shield children from all harm and discomfort, we're actually doing them a disservice. What's the reasoning behind this in your view?
He argues that overprotection can actually weaken children, preventing them from developing the resilience and independence they need to thrive in the world. He believes that allowing children to face challenges, make mistakes, and learn from their experiences is essential for their development.
It seems he's connecting this back to the idea of the lobster hierarchy. A lack of challenge leads to weakness, both physically and psychologically. He even talks about his own experience with his son, who, from what he describes, sounds like he was quite a handful.
Yeah, he was. He learned that setting clear boundaries and enforcing those boundaries was not only good for his son's behavior, but actually helped them develop a deeper connection. It's about finding that balance between love and discipline, providing a structure within which children can safely explore and grow.
I see. What he emphasizes is that clear rules and consistent boundaries actually make children feel more secure and loved. It provides a framework for understanding the world and their place in it. So it seems like Peterson is advocating for a balance between love and discipline, both in parenting and in life in general.
Absolutely. He believes that accepting limitations, facing challenges, and embracing discipline are essential for finding meaning and purpose in life, even in the face of suffering.
And that brings us to one of the most thought-provoking aspects of Peterson's work, his analysis of the biblical story of Cain and Abel.
Right. Peterson uses this story as a lens for understanding the duality of human nature, our capacity for both good and evil. He points to Cain's jealousy and resentment towards his brother Abel, leading him to commit a horrific act. This story, he suggests, speaks to the darker impulses that reside within each of us, impulses that we must confront if we are to live meaningful lives.
He focuses on the idea that confronting our own capacity for darkness is essential for personal growth and moral development. It's not about denying these impulses, but about acknowledging them, understanding them, and choosing a different path. It's a powerful message that resonates throughout Peterson's work, the idea that life is a constant struggle between good and evil, both within ourselves and in the world around us.
And that confronting these difficult truths rather than avoiding them is the key to living a meaningful life.
Well, that was quite a deep dive into just the first part of your source material. There's still so much to explore. We've only just scratched the surface of Peterson's ideas.
You're right, we've covered a lot of ground, but there's still much more to unpack. Peterson's work is incredibly rich and thought-provoking, and it deserves careful consideration.
So stay tuned, because in the next part of this deep dive, we'll continue our exploration of Dr. Jordan Peterson's fascinating and sometimes controversial ideas.
So picking up where we left off, I think it's important to highlight Peterson's emphasis on the importance of telling the truth, or at least striving to not lie.
Right, this is Rule 8 in his book, right, where he really delves into how our words and choices shape not only our perception of reality, but reality itself.
Exactly. He argues that trying to manipulate reality to fit some narrow, preconceived notion of how things should be is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it's like building a house on a foundation of sand. Eventually, it's going to crumble.
He uses this vivid analogy of a client who was struggling with paranoia. This client was fixated on honor and couldn't tolerate the slightest perceived insult.
So any perceived slight, real or imagined, would trigger this intense reaction.
Precisely. It caused all sorts of problems in his personal and professional life. But Peterson was able to connect with him by responding honestly, even when it wasn't what the client wanted to hear.
So it's like sometimes the truth hurts, but it's also the only way to truly understand ourselves and the world around us. It's through that honesty that we can begin to build a more solid foundation for our lives.
Yeah. And Peterson argues that when we lie, we create this gap between our perception of reality and reality itself. And that gap can grow into an abyss, pulling us down into confusion and suffering.
He also warns about the dangers of using language to manipulate and dominate others.
Right. He talks about those conversations where people are just trying to one-up each other, constantly vying for the top spot in the dominance hierarchy.
It's like a verbal arms race, where everyone is trying to outdo each other with bigger, better, more impressive stories. You walk away feeling empty and a bit embarrassed.
Exactly. Peterson contrasts that kind of manipulative talk with genuine dialogue where people are actually listening to each other and trying to understand each other's perspectives.
He's a big believer in the power of listening, isn't he? He says that if you truly listen without judgment, people will tell you the most amazing and unexpected things.
It's like opening a window into someone else's world and expanding your own understanding in the process. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Peterson delves into the idea that we outsource our sanity to others.
What does he mean by outsource our sanity? I'm not sure I follow.
He's observed that a lot of what we consider healthy mental function depends on our ability to use feedback from others to regulate our behavior.
So it's like we're constantly calibrating ourselves based on how others react to us. If someone gives us a puzzled look, we might rephrase what we just said. Or if someone laughs at our joke, it reinforces our sense of humor.
Exactly. He even compares it to the way lobsters size each other up in their dominance hierarchies. Remember how we talked about serotonin and posture? Well, it seems those subtle cues play a role in human interactions as well.
So posture matters. People. Stand tall, make eye contact, and project confidence. But seriously, it's fascinating to consider how our social interactions shape our sense of self. It's like we're constantly receiving feedback from others, whether we're conscious of it or not.
And this idea of social calibration ties into Peterson's emphasis on the importance of socialization, especially for children.
He has some strong opinions about how to raise kids, doesn't he?
He does. He argues that parents have a fundamental responsibility to make their children socially acceptable, not in the sense of conforming to some arbitrary standard, but in the sense of being able to function well in the world and have healthy relationships.
So it's about equipping them with the skills and behaviors that will allow them to navigate social situations effectively.
Right. He uses this funny but slightly disturbing anecdote about his son as a toddler who was a master manipulator.
Toddler, a master manipulator.
Apparently, his son would refuse to eat enough, wouldn't sleep through the night, and generally made life quite difficult for his parents.
So he was testing boundaries from a very young age.
Exactly. And Peterson realized that he had to set firm boundaries and not give in to his son's manipulative tactics.
He even compares his son to a monster, in a playful way, of course. It highlights this idea that even the most loving parents need to establish a clear hierarchy and enforce rules.
Yeah, he's a big advocate for discipline, but he's also clear that it should always be applied with love and understanding.
He believes that clear rules and consistent boundaries actually make children feel more secure and loved.
Because it gives them a predictable framework within which to explore the world and develop their independence.
And he also delves into the dangers of overprotection, arguing that it can actually stunt children's growth and development.
He uses this example of the Disney movie Sleeping Beauty, where the king and queen try to shield their daughter from all negativity.
But their overprotection makes her weaker and more vulnerable in the end, doesn't it? It's like they're trying to prevent her from experiencing any pain. They actually set her up for greater suffering.
Precisely. It's like he's saying that facing challenges and learning to cope with adversity is essential for developing strength and resilience.
He connects this back to the idea of the dominance hierarchy, doesn't he? Those who are sheltered from competition and struggle never develop the skills and confidence they need to succeed.
And that can lead to a whole host of problems later in life.
So it's about finding that balance, isn't it? Protecting children from unnecessary harm while also providing them with the opportunities to learn and grow through challenges.
Absolutely. Peterson also delves into some of the more controversial aspects of gender roles and differences.
This is where he's been criticized quite a bit, hasn't he? But he maintains that he's simply trying to understand the complex interplay of biology and culture in shaping human behavior.
He does. He points out that men and women have evolved different biological and psychological characteristics, which have influenced the roles they have traditionally played in society.
He also acknowledges that these roles have often been distorted and used to justify oppression and inequality.
But he insists that we need to understand the underlying biological realities if we want to create a more just and equitable society.
It's like he's saying, we can't just wish away these differences. We need to acknowledge them and find ways to create a society that works for everyone.
One of his key arguments is that men and women have different priorities when it comes to mate selection.
He cites evolutionary psychology research suggesting that women are generally more selective than men when choosing partners because they have a greater biological investment in childbearing and rearing.
Right. And this can lead to conflict, especially in modern societies where women are increasingly seeking both career success and fulfilling relationships.
So how do we reconcile these seemingly competing desires?
Peterson argues that we need to have honest conversations about these differences and find ways to create a society that supports both men and women in pursuing their goals.
He also critiques what he sees as the excesses of the feminist movement, arguing that some of its claims are based on ideology rather than evidence.
He's particularly critical of the idea that all gender differences are socially constructed.
He argues that this ignores the significant role that biology plays in shaping our behavior.
He's not saying that culture doesn't matter, but he believes that we need to acknowledge the biological realities if we want to create a society that works for everyone.
It's about finding that balance once again, recognizing the influence of both nature and nurture.
This is where his discussion of the terrible mother archetype comes in.
Now, this is a concept I'm not familiar with. Could you explain a bit more about what he means by terrible mother?
Sure. He's drawing on the work of Carl Jung and Erich Neumann, who saw the terrible mother as a symbol of the unconscious forces that can undermine consciousness and personal growth.
So it's not about literal mothers, but rather a symbolic representation of those forces that can hold us back.
Exactly. Peterson argues that this archetype can manifest itself in the form of overprotective mothers who stifle their children's independence. But it can also represent those internal forces that keep us trapped in fear and dependency.
Okay, yeah. He also connects it to the fear that some men have of women, seeing them as powerful and potentially destructive forces. It's a complex and somewhat controversial idea, but it highlights his belief that we need to confront both the positive and negative aspects of our nature, both within ourselves and in the world around us.
Right. Peterson also talks about the importance of discipline and challenge in helping boys become men.
He uses this amusing anecdote about working on a construction crew where the men would constantly test each other with insults and pranks.
Yeah, it was their way of establishing a hierarchy and evaluating each other's character. It might seem harsh, but Peterson argues that this kind of rough and tumble interaction, while not always pleasant, can actually be beneficial for boys.
It teaches them how to stand up for themselves, how to take a joke, and how to develop a thick skin.
He contrasts this with what he sees as the overprotected and coddled upbringing that many boys experience today.
He worries that this lack of challenge is leading to a generation of men who are unprepared for the demands of life. He uses this classic example of the Charles Atlas ad, the insult that made a man out of Mac.
Right. It's about this skinny guy who gets sand kicked in his face by a bully and then transforms himself into a muscle man through a bodybuilding program.
It's obviously an exaggerated story, but it captures something essential about the male psyche, doesn't it? The need for challenge, the desire to prove oneself, and the transformative power of discipline and hard work.
Peterson believes that boys need to be pushed outside their comfort zones to face their fears and to develop the strength and resilience they need to become fully realized men.
It's about facing those challenges head-on rather than shying away from them.
This is where his critique of minimal group identification comes in.
This is another term I'm not familiar with. Could you clarify what he means by this?
He's citing the work of social psychologist Henri Tajfel, who showed that people are incredibly quick to form in-groups and out-groups, even based on arbitrary criteria.
So even the smallest difference can become the basis for dividing people into us and them.
Exactly. And Peterson worries that this tendency is being exploited by identity politics, which divides people into competing groups based on race, gender, and other categories.
He argues that this kind of divisive thinking undermines our shared humanity and makes it harder to address the real problems facing society.
Right. He believes that we need to focus on what unites us as human beings rather than what divides us.
It's a call for unity in a world that often feels increasingly fractured and polarized.
Now, shifting gears again, Peterson shares a heart-wrenching story about his daughter's struggle with a debilitating autoimmune disease.
This is a very personal and vulnerable part of his book. He talks about his daughter, Michaela, developing severe juvenile rheumatoid arthritis when she was just a child.
Yeah, she experienced excruciating pain, had to undergo multiple surgeries, and was often unable to walk or even move without assistance.
It's a powerful reminder that life can be incredibly cruel and unfair, even to the most innocent among us. It's hard to imagine the pain and suffering both Michaela and her family endured.
Peterson describes the agony of watching his daughter suffer and the anger and despair he felt at the seeming injustice of it all.
It's a testament to his honesty and vulnerability that he's willing to share such a personal and painful experience.
Yeah. He talks about how he wrestled with the question of why a loving God would allow such suffering to exist.
It's a question that has haunted philosophers and theologians for centuries, hasn't it? And Peterson doesn't claim to have a definitive answer.
No, but he does offer some insights based on his own experience.
So what kind of insights did he glean from this incredibly challenging experience?
He talks about how his daughter's suffering forced him to confront his own limitations and to appreciate the preciousness of life. He also realized that his daughter's limitations were part of what made her lovable and unique.
It's a profound insight, the idea that our imperfections are part of what makes us human and worthy of love.
He connects this to the idea that suffering is an inevitable part of life.
And that learning to cope with suffering, to find meaning in it, is essential for personal growth and spiritual development.
Exactly. He even draws a parallel to the story of Superman, who was initially conceived as an all-powerful being with no weaknesses.
But Superman's creators realized that a character who can do anything is ultimately boring and unrelatable.
So they gave him limitations, like his vulnerability to kryptonite.
And those limitations are what make him a compelling and relatable character, aren't they? Because they force him to struggle, to make choices, and to face consequences.
Exactly. Peterson argues that the same is true for human beings. Our limitations are what make us interesting and give our lives meaning.
It's a challenging idea, but it's also deeply liberating because it suggests that we don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love and happiness.
Right. We can embrace our imperfections and find meaning in the struggles that make us who we are.
Peterson also talks about the importance of finding meaning in life, even in the face of tragedy and despair.
He cites the work of the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, who explored the depths of human suffering in his novels.
Dostoevsky's characters often grapple with questions of faith, meaning, and the existence of God.
Yeah, Peterson sees Dostoevsky's work as a testament to the human spirit's ability to find meaning, even in the darkest of circumstances. He also emphasizes the importance of action and engagement in finding meaning.
So it's not just about passively accepting suffering or giving in to despair. It's about actively seeking out challenges, pursuing our goals, and striving to make the world a better place.
Right. This is where his idea of the pen of light comes out.
The pen of light. That sounds intriguing. What's this all about?
He describes a thought experiment where he imagines being given a pen that can write words that will be inscribed on his soul.
So it's a metaphor for the choices we make and the values we embrace.
Exactly. He uses this metaphor to explore the question of what we should value most in life.
He asks himself a series of questions, such as, what shall I do tomorrow? And what shall I do next year?
And the answers he receives emphasize the importance of doing good, seeking truth, and striving for constant improvement.
It's a powerful reminder that we have the power to choose our values and to shape our lives accordingly.
Peterson also draws on the wisdom of religious traditions, particularly Christianity, in his search for meaning.
He sees the Bible as a rich source of insights into the human condition.
He's particularly interested in the stories of sacrifice and redemption that are central to the Christian faith.
He argues that these stories offer timeless wisdom about the nature of good and evil, the importance of facing our shadows, and the possibility of finding meaning through suffering.
He sees the story of Christ's crucifixion as the ultimate example of sacrifice.
Christ's willingness to endure suffering and death for the sake of humanity offers a model for how we can find meaning and purpose in our own lives.
Yeah, Peterson argues that we can all strive to embody Christ-like qualities, such as love, compassion, and selflessness.
He believes that by living in accordance with these values, we can make the world a better place and find meaning in the process. He also emphasizes the importance of humility and self-awareness in our pursuit of the good.
Right. He warns against the dangers of arrogance and self-righteousness. He believes that we need to be constantly questioning our own motives and assumptions.
And that we need to be open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
This is where his discussion of the uncarved block comes in.
Uncarved block. What does he mean by that?
He's drawing on the Taoist concept of the uncarved block as a metaphor for the state of pure potential.
So it's about being open to possibilities and not letting our preconceived notions limit our growth.
Exactly. He argues that we should strive to be like the uncarved block, open to possibilities, adaptable to change, and free from rigid preconceptions.
He believes that this kind of openness and flexibility is essential for navigating the complexities of life, and that it's the key to finding true meaning and happiness.
It's about embracing the unknown rather than trying to control it.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Dr. Jordan Peterson's work. We've explored his ideas on everything from lobsters and dominance hierarchies to the nature of good and evil and the importance of telling the truth.
Yeah, his work is certainly thought-provoking, even if you don't agree with everything he says.
He challenges us to confront the uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world around us. He encourages us to take responsibility for our lives and to strive for excellence in all that we do.
And he offers a vision of a world where meaning and purpose can be found even in the face of suffering.
But there's one final thread we need to pull on, one that connects many of Peterson's ideas together.
And that's the concept of sacrifice.
How does sacrifice fit into all of this? It seems like a rather heavy and perhaps even outdated concept. You're right, sacrifice can feel kind of heavy, maybe even a bit outdated. But I'm curious how Peterson connects it to everything else we've been discussing.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating how he weaves this idea of sacrifice into so many aspects of his thinking. Remember how we talked about evolution being conservative? Well, even lobsters sacrifice in a way. A defeated lobster essentially sacrifices its dominant brain and grows a new one adapted to its subordinate position.
Wow, that's such a striking image. literally sacrificing a part of yourself to adapt to a new reality. I'm starting to see how this idea extends beyond just giving something up.
Exactly. Peterson sees sacrifice as this fundamental principle woven into the fabric of existence. It's about making a conscious choice to align yourself with what is meaningful, even if it's difficult.
So it's not about deprivation for its own sake, but about making choices that lead to growth, even if those choices involve some level of loss or discomfort.
Precisely.
Hmm.
Think about Peterson's emphasis on telling the truth. He argues that honesty often requires sacrificing our desire for comfort, approval, or even self-preservation.
Yeah, like that powerful story he shared about the client struggling with the aftermath of a sexual assault. He could have easily told her what she wanted to hear, confirming her victimhood. But instead, he chose to be honest, even though it was painful for both of them.
It was a sacrifice of his own comfort and perhaps even his reputation to help her confront the truth and move forward in a healthier way.
So he was choosing the more difficult, but ultimately more meaningful path. This reminds me of what he says about cleaning your room. It's a small sacrifice in the present that can have this ripple effect, creating more order and meaning in your life.
That's a great connection. And Peterson even links this idea of sacrifice to biblical stories like Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel.
Oh, right. Those stories are full of sacrifice. Adam and Eve are banished from paradise after eating from the tree of knowledge, sacrificing their blissful ignorance for self-awareness. And then there's Cain, who murders his brother Abel out of envy, sacrificing his relationship with God and his own humanity.
And Peterson sees these stories as profound metaphors for the choices we face. Will we choose the path of sacrifice, of confronting our limitations and striving for something greater, even if it means pain and loss? Or will we give in to our baser instincts, sacrificing our integrity and ultimately our souls for fleeting gratification?
You know, what you're saying is making me rethink my entire understanding of sacrifice. It's not just about giving something up, it's about choosing a path, a way of being in the world.
He argues that embracing sacrifice, both in small, everyday ways and in those big, life-defining moments, is essential for finding meaning and purpose. It's about orienting yourself towards the future, towards growth and transformation.
It's like he's saying we can choose to cling to the comfort and security of the present, but in doing so, we might be sacrificing a future that is more aligned with our values and aspirations.
This brings up an important question for our listeners. What are you willing to sacrifice for? What are your values? What do you believe is truly important? And are you making the choices that reflect those values, even if it means some level of discomfort or sacrifice?
It's a challenge to confront, but a necessary one, I think. He's prompting us to do an inventory of our lives, to identify the things that are truly meaningful, and let go of what's holding us back.
He also encourages us to think about sacrifice in terms of what we're willing to take on. What responsibilities are we willing to shoulder? What burdens are we willing to bear?
It's about contributing to something greater than ourselves, taking ownership of our lives, and making a difference in the world, even in small ways.
He uses the example of people who choose to work in demanding professions, those who care for the sick, the elderly, the vulnerable. They're making a sacrifice of their time, their energy, and their comfort to serve others.
It's not about self-denial for its own sake, but about aligning your actions with your values, even when it's difficult.
And it's not just limited to certain professions. We can all make choices that reflect this principle. Maybe it's choosing to spend time with family instead of mindlessly scrolling through social media, or speaking up against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, these everyday choices, these small sacrifices, can shape the kind of future we create, both for ourselves and for those around us.
Peterson even connects sacrifice to the concept of the future, arguing that the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we actively create through our choices and our actions.
So if we're only focused on immediate gratification, on avoiding discomfort, we're sacrificing the possibility of a better future. But if we're willing to make those difficult choices, to confront our limitations and strive for something greater, we open ourselves up to a future that is more aligned with our values and aspirations.
It's powerful stuff. Peterson's work doesn't shy away from the complexities of life, but it also offers a path forward, a way to find meaning and purpose even in the face of suffering.
Absolutely. This deep dive has really given me a lot to think about. The choices I'm making, the sacrifices I'm willing to embrace, and the kind of future I want to create. What about you? What stands out most from what we've explored today?
You know, for me, it's the realization that sacrifice isn't about deprivation. It's about making conscious choices, aligning our actions with our values, and taking responsibility for creating a more meaningful and fulfilling life. It's a challenge, but a rewarding one.
Well said. That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the work of Dr. Jordan Peterson. It's been an enlightening conversation.
It has. Thanks for having me.